the bigger picture around the rodeo system, it's pretty easy to see clearly that there is a lot of injustice happening. But then when you are operating within an unjust system, it is adding some level of benefit for people. But that doesn't make it just in any way. It just makes it a little bit better.
Since 1965, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola, has held an incredibly popular public event known as the Prison Rodeo, where incarcerated men participate for cash prizes in contests so dangerous they have been banned from the professional rodeo circuit. Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the United States and uses their inmates to farm thousands of acres of land, selling crops and livestock to some of the biggest companies in the world, all while paying laborers pennies on the hour. Our guest today is Adam Mahoney, a reporter for Capital B, a local and national nonprofit news organization that publishes in-depth journalism on topics of crucial importance to Black people across the country. Adam's recent article titled "The Wildest Show in the South, Spectacle and Suffering at America's Biggest Prison" first brought this shocking event to my attention. And for this episode, he discusses with me the surreal reality of the Angola Prison Rodeo and his experience attending, gives me a background on the dark history of the penitentiary itself, and tells me the various perspectives of those involved in this shocking and deeply American spectacle. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am really happy to welcome Adam Mahoney to American Hysteria. We're going to have a lot to talk about today. Adam, thank you for being here. This is the first time we've ever talked, so I'm excited to get to know you a little bit as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited as well. This is a lot to dive into.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. And yeah, I was put in contact with you, I believe, by your agent, and she sent me a copy of the article that you recently wrote about the Angola prison and the rodeo that they put on. And it was a pretty stunning revelation to learn about. I had no idea that something like this was going on, let alone was ever going on, but, you know, into this day. In fact, this last month in April, right, was the most recent rodeo.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I was in the same boat as you prior to me moving to Louisiana. And, you know, my first couple of months living in New Orleans, I kept hearing about the rodeo from folks who grew up here and their experiences as children. And it was, yeah, I mean, it's a wild space and a wild thing to even imagine exists, especially in 2025.
Yeah, no kidding. And what about it made you decide you wanted to explore it further and actually do an full piece about it?
Yeah, I mean, I've known about the Angola prison for years now. And for folks who don't know, Angola is the largest prison in the United States. It's located on 18,000 acres, which is pretty close to the size of Manhattan in New York. And I had first heard about Angola through the memoir of Albert Woodfox, who recently passed away, but was a political prisoner at Angola for over 40 years and was held in solitary confinement for the longest period in U.S. history, which was 4 decades. And Angola, I mean, off bat, that is kind of insane to think. But yeah. Angola, the roots of Angola are deeply situated in the history of the United States and the history of the South. It is located on the site of a former slave plantation that was named the Angola plantation because most of the enslaved folks there were taken from the West African country, Angola. Today, like I said, it has been transformed into a prison, the largest prison in the U.S. It has a deeply kind of devastating history, especially for Black folks in Louisiana. Its roots are in, you know, the sharecropping system, the slave convict system. For over a century, the Angola prison has been operating as a farm where incarcerated people are making as little as, 20 cents a day growing food that is sold in supermarkets across the country. And, that is a really jarring fact.
Yeah.
But then when you combine that with this cultural element of rodeos and cowboys and what that means for the South, and that the prison system has been operating as kind of this cultural hub on top of this violence and harm, and that it has really infiltrated not only like the state's culture, but it is an event that draws people from all over the country.
Yeah. And this particular prison rodeo that's happening at Angola, which I think we should talk a little bit more about in a second, but it is not the only one, right? This was something that was happening in different states for a long time.
Yes, exactly. I mean, prison rodeos, particularly in the 60s and 70s, were a major thing across the country, particularly in the South, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Georgia, the Carolinas. They all had various means of prison rodeos. And really, at that time, the prison system was actually a major hub of culture and entertainment. I don't know if folks recently saw the movie Sinners that came out, and not to give a spoiler, it's not really important for the plot, but there's a very short scene in Sinners where a character talks about his time after he was arrested in the 1930s, and he was put on tour by the sheriff and performed for white folks across Mississippi. And that was a reality at the time of prison rodeos. When they were first being born, there was also a system of prison entertainers where, musicians who were incarcerated were kind of paraded across the South, performing for, wealthier white folks without receiving any pay.
Right. So there's definitely a precedent for what we're talking about today.
Exactly. Yeah. And the Angola Prison Rodeo, which is the largest prison rodeo and longest running prison rodeo in U.S. history, started in 1965. So, right around the time of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And it has existed throughout our supposed history of understanding human and civil rights in this country.
Right. And I mean, I think to show folks how big this was in, the 60s, probably 70s as well. We had people like Dolly Parton, Johnny Cash that I read about who were performing at these rodeos. And I'm sure we'll get kind of into the very complicated nature of the meaning of these rodeos for folks. But, it was a really, really strange thing to read that this was such a fixture, it seems like, in the American South.
Yeah. I mean, cowboys, rodeos, that kind of tradition is very deeply embedded in Southern life and has been for generations. And it's really interesting when you kind of take a step back and look at where and kind of how this American icon was created, right? And that throughout history, it has really been associated with white America's conquering of this land and of, as manifest destiny and moving west. And that kind of, as we saw in the, early 20th century with movies and entertainment really focused around the cowboys versus, Indian trope. And that was really interesting to explore because I think in the setting of a prison, and particularly in the context of the United States, where we have, such large racial inequities in who is imprisoned, that we have, quote unquote, Black performers playing this role of the American hero, which really doesn't coincide with our idea of a convict or an incarcerated person who is typically associated with kind of a nameless and underclass status.
Right. It almost made me think of the Wild West shows that we used to have where, Indigenous people would be on tour as, this noble savage archetype that then kind of, I don't know, it's like a weird way that people turn this type of oppression into entertainment to almost feel better about it somehow. I don't know. That was just something that came to me.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely correct in that reading. And even, visiting the rodeo where it is mainly Black folks inside performing, and then mainly white people, watching the rodeo. There's this kind of idea that folks who are participating in the spectacle that they hold, that like race and power doesn't exist in this space.
Yeah.
That somehow through this performance, you are creating kind of a equal playing field in a level class situation. But in reality, it's very much so the opposite.
Yeah, anything but. Yeah. All right. So you actually went to the rodeo this year or the year before?
Yeah. So I visited the rodeo last October.
Right. Okay. So maybe we can get into some of what actually goes on at these rodeos, because, it runs the gamut from incarcerated people being able to create their own crafts and sell them to events that have actually been banned in rodeos outside of the prison context. So I think if we can start to really get into what this looks like on the level of what you saw while you were there as well.
Yeah. So I visited the Angola Prison Rodeo last October, kind of in still the heat of summer heat. Mm-hmm. It's about 2.5 hours outside of New Orleans. And like I said, it's situated on 18,000 acres of land. So first, to even get to the prison rodeo, you have to drive maybe about a mile and a half inland into the prison. So you're passing, the acres of farmland that incarcerated people, work the fields at during peak heat for little to no pay before you reach the arena, which typically, there are a couple of thousand folks that come out every weekend. And like you mentioned, it is broken into two drastically different experiences.
Yeah.
So you have inside of the arena where the rodeo events are actually taking place. You might think of the stereotypical American rodeo experience. You're coming in, you have your American flags, you have folks wearing their cowboy hats and their cowboy boots, definitely some Make America Great Again gear in there as well. But immediately as you walk into the arena, you are met with incarcerated folks in their garb, blue jeans and white shirts, watching as well behind a massive fence, completely isolated and separated from you as a free person. And when you get to your seat, you do really feel the total experience. So like I actually only lasted maybe 15 minutes inside of the rodeo.
Wow.
Because in the first 5 minutes of me sitting down, there was an event where an incarcerated man fell off of his horse and pretty much snapped his neck.
What?
And was down on the ground for about 10 minutes, had to be carted off. And that's a normal experience.
Right.
To take a step back, these are folks who don't have any training in these acts, right? And the main reason why people participate in the rodeo is, one, it's an opportunity to get outside of your cell for a little bit. And two, there's a chance to receive some money if you do win some of these events.
Right.
And it's important to note that the vast majority of the events that take place at the Angola Prison Rodeo are actually events that don't exist in your normal rodeo circuit. And some have even been banned on the rodeo circuit. So some of the big events, there's convicts poker, which is where they have 4 incarcerated people sit at a card table in the middle of the arena. And then they release a bull from its pen, and the bull charges at the table, and the last person sitting at the table receives a prize of somewhere between $200 and $300. So you're literally, risking your life for $200, which goes a long way in your books for some people, right? Especially if you are someone incarcerated for many years and don't have that family and outside support anymore.
Right.
They also have another rodeo event called Guts or Glory, which is when a couple dozen incarcerated people are released into the arena, and they're all vying to take a $500 poker chip between the horns of a bull. So in that case, when you are running towards a 2,000-pound animal, that does mean many people are going to get tossed or bucked or trampled.
Right.
And then another event is the wild horse race, which has been banned pretty much on all American rodeo circuits. But this is when they have 6 wild horses running through the arena, and they are dragging on a short rope incarcerated people behind them. And it is whoever lasts the longest on the rope wins the prize. So these are all things that are dangerous to even someone who has been training for years.
Yeah.
But particularly deadly and damaging for folks who have no training or really even understanding sometimes of what they're getting themselves into. But it's for entertainment. While I was inside the rodeo, I definitely heard a lot of weird racialized comments, a lot of comments about the worth of the incarcerated people participating. Mm-hmm. And the social dynamics of America, the racial dynamics were on full display and really even more intensified than you would, ever find in a normal day to day. It did truly feel dehumanizing.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more complicated than that. Like I said, there are two drastically different experiences that you can have at the rodeo. So you can go inside and have that hyper-racialized experience, or you can take a step outside where they have a massive arts and craft market where incarcerated people have the opportunity to sell crafts and artwork that they, have created. So you'll have, paintings. There's a leather working workshop within the prison. So you'll have people selling, belts. There's wood making. So there are people selling chairs and different panels. And that space, it does feel actually deeply humanizing. It is one of the few times that incarcerated people have the opportunity, one, to interact with folks on the outside and interact with folks who are not, their friends, their family. But it also offers them a time where they can sit freely, no shackles, no guard over their shoulder with their family. So I met folks who, they had their children there, their parents, their significant others. They were able to share a meal, hug each other, talk and talk about, normal day-to-day things that you don't really have the opportunity to when it is a high stakes, high pressure. This is my only phone call with you for the next 2 weeks. And that is really what actually draws a lot of folks to the rodeo, particularly Black and brown people. That is where I saw a majority of the Black visitors. They were outside shopping, allowing them to put money on people's books, and having actual conversations with folks.
Yeah. And I mean, from other articles I read about this same thing, you talked about how these men are able to, be making money for themselves, but it also sounds like they are trying to make money for their families on the outside at the same time. So it seems like a very emotional place. And I don't know, you said while you were there, it felt like, good maybe isn't the right word, but it felt like a healing place.
Yeah, exactly. As healing as you could feel in a setting with such a deeply rooted and harmful history for a lot of the people visiting and incarcerated there. But yeah, in many ways, it is healing. It is a chance for people, which was really interesting for me to, when I was having conversations with incarcerated people, like this is one of actually really the only time every year that they're able to meet new people, right, that are not incarcerated and have conversations that don't have to do with being in prison. And at the same time, like you said, these are also people that have, costs themselves. And typically statistics show that incarcerated people are, majority low income people. So they're also not folks that have the financial support on the outside. And I spoke with some incarcerated people that, make over $1,000, selling their crafts during the couple of weekends where the rodeo exists. And it also allows people to create relationships, even in the aftermath. I've received mail from incarcerated people that I met last October. And then that's something that can continue outside of just that, those very quick interactions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it feels very surprising to me that, this type of arts and crafts festival. I know that there's also food that incarcerated people are able to make, like family recipes especially. And it's just interesting to me because it's surprising that this is being allowed to happen where there is the ability to kind of move freely among people who aren't incarcerated. So how did this come to be? Do you know the history of not the rodeo part, but this part that we've been talking about?
I am not fully versed on the history of the arts fair, but I think one of the interesting things, because I had, this kind of question myself in terms of when you are looking at, well, I mean, the prison system operates to isolate, and the fact that people can share space. I think a very important thing to know is, one, just the size of Angola prison. So there's really the quote unquote risk from the prison system is very low when you are operating on a prison that is as big as Manhattan.
Right. So then maybe we can talk a little bit more about Angola, because it isn't just a prison. I mean, we've talked about it also being a farm, but it seems like it's like its own entire city. Would you tell us a little bit more about Angola and how it operates?
Yeah. So after, the state of Louisiana purchased the plantation in the late 1800s and converted into a prison facility, an entire city system kind of grew around it, because it is a massive piece of land holding thousands of people and employing hundreds more. So on the outskirts of the facility, there is housing for folks that work inside of the prison. There's corner stores and grocery stores, and it does fully operate kind of as an isolated community, all hinged on this massive prison system. And throughout much of the 20th century, Angola gained a lot of notoriety, one, because of its size, but also because it kind of transformed into, statistically one of the more violent and dangerous prisons in the United States. It was, incarcerated people working there were used to build a levee system along the Mississippi River around that time.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And since then, like I said, it has operated as a farm. A recent investigation by the Associated Press a couple of years ago found that in some of the most major brands across the country, they are using crops grown at Angola. So like Kellogg uses crops and materials grown at Angola in their products.
Wow.
So they're sold all across the country. Like I said, while incarcerated people are making little to nothing. In Louisiana, just for some very important context, Louisiana leads the nation in incarceration, which also means that if it was its own country, Louisiana would have the highest incarceration rate in the world.
Wow, yeah.
And it is also the only state that legally requires incarcerated people to work. So if you think about a place like Angola and a farm that is highly profitable, you are forcing people to work without pay.
Yeah.
Which sounds a lot like a former system that we had in this country.
Yes, it does. I did not know that about the work requirement. I've never heard that before, which also feels just wild to not know that, and the forces that make it so that people like me do not know that. More after this. And now back to the show. So we've talked a little bit about it, but can you give us some insight into the demographics of this prison and how that relates to what we see with the rodeo as well?
Yeah. In Louisiana and at Angola prison, roughly 80% of the people incarcerated are Black. And Louisiana is the second Blackest state in the country, but still the share of Black residents is a little under a third here. So it's quite a big discrepancy and inequity in who is incarcerated in this state, in Angola, which has deep roots, obviously, in the systems that predated Angola. But that plays a major role in how this cultural event is seen. The communities surrounding Angola are majority white, and the folks that grew up going to the Prison Rodeo and then still go today are also majority white. So it has kind of turned into a minstrel show in a sense, in terms of, there is a lot of acts of dehumanization and not seeing people for actual human beings in this space. I had a really interesting experience outside at the market. I was behind a group of teenagers, one of them wearing a MAGA shirt, complaining about not being able to haggle prices down from an incarcerated man. And I think it was very disheartening, but it wasn't unexpected. And I think the main reason is, obviously this is a very jarring situation, but the social dynamics that exist inside of that place exist outside of it too. Particularly when we're thinking about the context of Louisiana today, which many would say the policies that have been passed in the last year and a half under Governor Jeff Landry kind of are setting the stage for the federal policies that we're seeing passed under the Trump administration. Louisiana has been on a very stark and even strong rightward shift over the last couple of years. And it is, like I said, it's on full display when you are in that space.
And what are some of the things that you're referencing from the governor that has been changing?
Yeah. So last year, pushed by Jeff Landry, the state of Louisiana virtually ended all chances of parole for incarcerated people, which is another layer. If you think about Angola, which is a maximum security prison where it is mainly people who are serving decades-long sentences or life sentences. So these are people who now know they have virtually no chance of ever leaving Angola. And that plays a role in your willingness to participate in an event like this.
Yeah.
Outside of that, Landry has been strongly pushing to bring the age that people are tried at for adult crimes to 17 across the board, no matter what the quote unquote, crime you are alleged to commit or are convicted of.
Yeah. That has
played a major role. And that all feeds into the fact that, like I said, Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate in the world.
I mean, it sounds to me like they are incentivizing arrest and conviction because they have this really vast for-profit situation happening. Would you agree that may be a part of this that's going on right now, that, at Angola, they have this massive farming system?
Yeah, speaking with advocates and people incarcerated and formerly incarcerated in the state of Louisiana, that is kind of definitely a consensus across the board.
Yeah.
I mean, it plays into all of the different inequities that we see in the state. I mean, it is one of the 5 most poor states in this country. Like I said, it has a high Black population. It is an extremely right state and conservative state. In many ways, we have seen, not only in recent years, but over the last couple of decades, how the prison system has operated as a moneymaker.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people kind of associate this with the for-profit private prison system and not necessarily the state-run facilities like this. But as Angola shows, it is a reality.
Yeah. So I also read in your article that there are a lot of conflicting feelings about especially the rodeo part of what we're talking about. And of course, that's not surprising. Would you want to start to get into some of those contradictions of the people who especially participate in these rodeos?
Yeah. So while I was there, I met a man named Tony Grimes, who actually had just been released from Angola after serving over 20 years in the Louisiana prison system. And he really kind of laid out the realities and the contradictions for me in a way that I wasn't necessarily thinking about, because I was sitting in a place of, quite honestly, a little bit of fear and also disgust of being there.
Yeah.
But he made the point, when you think of Louisiana and all of the things that we've laid out about kind of the power of the prison system, and then, the thousands of people involved in it, and then the millions of dollars that are moving through it all of the time, it is one of the more powerful, political tools that the state of Louisiana has to kind of ensure the racial and economic system at play continues. Mm-hmm. But even while understanding that, as someone incarcerated, he understands what that rodeo means for people. So, Grimes told me while he was incarcerated, he was, initially disgusted by how many of his, fellow inmates wanted to participate in it. And he was also really disturbed when he would go to the rodeo and work the rodeos and sell crafts that he saw so many Black faces. And then he had to take a step back and he realized, you know, he was coming from a place where he had some financial support.
Yeah.
There was money being put on his books, and he did have family close by that he saw, you know, somewhat regularly. For a lot of people, that wasn't the reality. He also talked about the fact that, you know, allowing people the opportunity to be outside and to exist, even if it is in a brief moment, as like a human with some sense of an ability to kind of dictate your movement, what you're talking about, what you're doing, and also to be in a place where at a lot of moments there's a lot of joy being shared.
Yeah.
Even inside the rodeo and outside of it. And while he tried to get incarcerated people to boycott the rodeo early on in his sentence, he quite quickly realized that it truly just brought a familiar feeling for people, and it brought them kind of a feeling of being able to freely exist in a way that does not normally happen in the system of incarceration.
So then these contradictions are happening while at the same time the audience is having their own experience watching. And I would imagine if you're going there, unless maybe you're a journalist or an activist of some kind, you're likely going out of a sense of wanting to be there and enjoying this, which I also imagine is something like an event passed down through families who come to watch the rodeo. And you've already kind of talked about some of the demographics of the people that are watching. What do you think the experience is like for those people? What is the reason that they're going? And I know that's a big question and there are many different answers, but do you have a sense of what that might be?
Yeah, I mean, the experience, one, is definitely racialized. I'll say for Black folks in Louisiana, for, you know, Creole folks in Louisiana, this idea of cowboy culture is truly a part of what it means to be from this place, right? And as we have, you know, seen kind of urbanization and modernization across the country in Louisiana in more recent years, a lot of the history and access to this cultural mainstay has kind of dwindled, and the Angola Prison Rodeo hasn't. So for one, you know, I talked to a woman who, you know, she traveled from Texas and then wanted to come back the next weekend to bring her grandchildren because this thing that she grew up with, maybe not the Angola Prison Rodeo, but the rodeo system no longer exists in the same way that it does. And it means something to her culturally, and it means something, you know, to her family. And I think there's also levels of like trying to place yourself within this power structure. So there's the reality that like there is millions of dollars being pumped into Angola because of this rodeo. And then, you know, your idealized version of what this means is like, if there's more money in this prison system, there might be, you know, more opportunities for incarcerated people, whether that's education opportunities or better access to healthcare or renovations that can be made. So I did talk to people that kind of placed their selves within that larger structure of like, if there's a way that I can help better their experience somehow, this is how I'm doing it. And, you know, I talked to plenty of people who grew up going to the rodeo too. I talked to a woman who, you know, some of her fondest memories, she said, with her father as a child were walking through the market and looking at the boots and the belts. And she remembered buying a Hello Kitty belt as a child. And that is something, a memory that has stayed with her for decades, so much so that she brought her partner that October so that they could share that memory as well. And I think, you know, on the flip side, when you're thinking about, you know, maybe white visitors and white attendees, it also speaks to this idea of Southern tradition, which we know tradition and maintaining the power structure and you know, quote unquote, white America is really guiding all of our politics right now. And this is just another level of like ensuring that history that people want to hold on to so badly does not, you know, cease to exist.
Yeah.
I mean, that also just then plays a role in how we are maintaining a deeply kind of racist and unjust prison system when you intertwine the cultural aspects with the political aspects of Louisiana.
So when you're talking about the money part, that is a nice idea, right? That the money made from these rodeos would go directly back into programs that would support prisoners in different ways. Do you find that that is actually happening, or are we seeing any type of corruption around the money made? Just seems, it wouldn't be surprising to me if there was.
Yeah, I will say the state says that the rodeo revenue does support pretty much all of the education programs. So they said it supports the trade school programs, their high school education program, and has even helped bolster their hospice care system.
Okay.
As for reporting on where the actual money has filtered into, that is very sparse. And it also is by design. It is very, very difficult to get any kind of information from the Louisiana prison system.
I'm sure.
So it's kind of hard to say exactly, but I will say from incarcerated people that I spoke to, folks who have been incarcerated for many years, overall, the care that they've received has improved over the last couple of years, but that's also could be something, your level of care jumping from a 2 to 4. So does,
right.
What does that actually mean for you? But for people actively living that jump means a lot.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult thing in terms of like the bigger picture around the rodeo system is it's pretty easy to see clearly that there is a lot of injustice happening. But then when you are operating within an unjust system, it is adding some level of benefit for people. But that doesn't make it just in any way. It just makes it a little bit better.
No, I mean, it doesn't make it just when you're operating at such a low level of having your needs met. It makes sense why people who are incarcerated would take the opportunity to participate in something like this. I mean, I can't imagine not wanting a break from their day-to-day life, right? And what I think is kind of particularly sinister about this is that I imagine that something like this could happen that fits within the general rules of rodeo as it exists now. Like the fact that the events are so hyper dangerous is, I imagine, part of this draw for people. But that, it just feels like the fact that they're not abiding by the safety regulations of this sport, that they are, because it's not part of, I imagine, a official rodeo circuit, that they can just bypass anything they want like that. And that just feels different than just saying, oh, this is a rodeo that is benefiting people, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it plays into how Americans view the prison system and view incarcerated people. I mean, like I said, I truly think a lot of people who attend and then we're watching the events are not seeing human beings in front of them.
Yeah.
And if they are, they believe whatever those people are experiencing, they deserve. And I'm not here to, decide what someone deserves or doesn't deserve, but that definitely plays a role in why it's able to exist. And living in New Orleans, like I said, which is about 2.5 hours outside of Angola and is in a blue city, the idea of around the rodeo is one of disgust and hatred. And there has been, petitions and work done to try to get it to stop existing. But if you drive 20 miles outside of the city, you're going to get a completely different view and understanding of the rodeo and of Angola as an institution.
Right. It seems like there is so much patriotic imagery. I know that they're doing the national anthem, which is also feels so surreal. And you got a sense when you were in there and from your research that those people going and those people experiencing this and the people promoting this, is there a sense of American patriotism attached?
Yeah, I mean, definitely larger American patriotism for sure. But I do think Louisiana is just a very unique place when we think about not only the way that race is constructed here, but also like pride and power, which has been really unique for me, having only lived in the state for a year and a half. But a lot of it is about maintaining Louisiana.
Interesting. Okay.
As things are shifting around this state. You know, Texas in many ways is as conservative as Louisiana, but Texas has cities with millions of people, and Texas has urban density and modernization that Louisiana does not have. A lot of it is about ensuring that the lifestyle that has fed families here for, you know, generations, and that has kept people here for generations continues. One of the things that I think is important to note when you like think about Louisiana and culture here, you know, statistically, it is a place where families here have the longest roots in the state. Across the country, you will have more lineage amongst residents here than other places. Like, this is a place that people stay.
Yeah.
And it is honestly not really a place that people move to. It's the only state in the country where home values are declining. So it doesn't make sense for folks from, you know, California and the Northeast. If they're looking to buy a big home, they're not doing it here because they're not going to make any money.
Right.
So this is all about keeping Louisiana, just as much as it is about, you know, quote unquote, making America great again.
More after this. And now back to the show. Do you have any idea why Louisiana is so like insular kind of in that way, why they're particularly, I guess patriotic's not the right word. I don't know, state-triotic. That was stupid, but you know what I'm trying to say? Like, why Louisiana has that kind of, value.
Yeah, I think, you know, it might be similar to, you know, we have Mississippi just to the east of us and Alabama. These are places that for a long time were seen as undesirable, and places that it was slower to urbanize and slower to get investment and to see, you know, shifts in the resources and access to resources that people have. So there's also a level of pride in being able to say that, like, we're existing here without the care and support from maybe the federal government or folks outside of this place. In return, you kind of do have a major sense of kind of community camaraderie and once again, that desire to keep this place for Louisianans.
Right. Okay. So just to kind of return again to the rodeo itself, learning about this, obviously, as we've talked about, there are really conflicting feelings about the value that the rodeo has for the participants. And I think, you know, a $500 prize, that's clearly going to be a huge incentive, especially to someone who doesn't have, as we talked about before, any hope of parole or anything other than this kind of life that stretches into the future indefinitely. And the incentive it's almost not fair to call it an incentive, because it's almost like a forced experience for people who have no other income when they're making 4 cents an hour, right? It just feels like even when we're looking at it through this positive, quote unquote, obviously positive lens, there's this underlying sense that it's hard to consent to something like this fully.
Yeah, it is. It's deeply complicated. And I will say, like, even talking to incarcerated people, and when you lay all of the different factors out on the table, it is very easy to come to the conclusion that there really isn't much free will in this case, right? Like, to your point, you have a choice, but given the systems and structures at place, the decision has really been made for you. But I will say that, like, some incarcerated people I talked to, they did take offense to that line of questioning about if they kind of were forced to do this. And amongst readers online, like, if we did have any negative responses to this article, which they were mainly from white folks, but it was along the line of people participating in the rodeo had a choice not to which I think is really interesting and to interrogate within the prison system at large when you think about free will and the choices, the quote unquote choices that are in front of people. But for me as a spectator, as me, someone that has come in with a very specific understanding of Angola and a very specific understanding of the people who are fed into Angola, it doesn't feel like a choice. But yeah, I mean, within the system, this is how you might be able to get an extra cup of noodle or get some Pop-Tarts or get some new shoes, is by, in a way, risking your health.
Yeah. And it's not something that when you're inside that context, you're going to necessarily be thinking about all of the intellectual parts of what's happening. You're just like, I have this opportunity to do something that is different and gives me some excitement, maybe a sense of honor. Like if you are out there and you are winning and you are like on stage, essentially, like those are all things that anyone would want to do. And I understand like why you wouldn't be necessarily like deciding to look at all of the systemic issues around you and then critiquing your own desire to be a part of this. Like, you know, it's just not, it's never going to be the same thing when you and I are out here talking about something, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and really to break it down, like, so when I, went to the rodeo in October, it was with humidity 100 degrees. So like if your option is I'm going to be out on the farm working the land for 16 cents for 8 hours, or I can potentially make $500 inside of the rodeo. Like what choice are you going to make there? It's a loser's game in many ways. But I think as a reporter, and then after having conversations with folks, like I did take heed to their perspective, because that is the reality within, that they're operating within.
Yeah, of course. And it also feels dark to me because from the perspective of the people who are not incarcerated, who are benefiting from this rodeo, that this is this kind of way to be like, look, we're putting on this rodeo where incarcerated people can win all this money, and then they don't have to ever consider the fact that these people should be paid more for the work that they're doing day to day on the farm. It just feels like this, almost like a sleight of hand, like look over here, watch this, and watch, these people who really are excited to be a part of this thing. And wow, they could win some money. And it feels like as a spectator, you could really buy into that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I talked to someone who said this was their best day of the year. Like,
fuck, yeah.
How do you end that then? What do they have?
Yeah.
I mean, quite frankly, like what do they have to live for then if you are pulling this moment that they're expressing it as a moment of joy for them? It's difficult.
Yeah.
It's a difficult thing to interrogate. But I do think, like I said, sharing space with folks and seeing it from their perspective was really helpful for me. I don't know if it changes anything about the deeply degrading events that are happening inside that prison, but at least for a day, some people expressed really saying they felt like a human again.
Right. Yeah. Which is, we're really holding a lot of simultaneous truths here in this conversation, I think.
Yeah. And I was going to bring in one point just about also the kind of culture around rodeos in the United States in the moment that we find ourselves in. Like I had actual conversations with people who like wanted to come to the rodeo because of Cowboy Carter and the Beyonce album. And this idea of reclaiming the Black roots of cowboys, horse riding, rodeos, all of those things, which do have real history and real roots in Black and Creole life in this country.
Yeah.
And it speaks once again to this idea that like, if everything else around you is crumbling, there is like the Black invitational rodeo that travels the country, but that's really the only major rodeo circuit for Black folks around the country, which means if you're not in Texas, you might have a rodeo, and you're living in a big town, you might have a rodeo once every 2 years. But if you feel like that is a part of your culture, if you're like, you grew up listening to stories about your grandparents, which, my great grandparents in Louisiana live in St. Landry Parish, like they had roots in this culture, right? And they were riding horses and then considered themselves cowboys.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's deeply removed from my life today, but it's something that predating Beyonce, something that I've been really interrogating and trying to figure out ways to integrate back into my life. Would I do that through the prison rodeo? No, but that doesn't mean that for some folks, this is the only instance where they see themselves having access to this experience, which is sad and disheartening.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, but I think the term cowboy was originally a term used for black cowhands. Like there's a serious history in cowboy culture that is not the hyper white image that we have today, right? Like Beyonce was really calling back to something, which I think was why it was deeply, deeply frustrating to see her be so locked out of the golden gates of pop country.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and then if you get into the racial dynamics of this situation, this is a time when you are seeing Black men riding horses, and it would be one of the few times that you would go to a rodeo and it be majority Black.
Yeah.
Which is, I've used this word a billion times on this call already, but it's just so complicated.
Yeah. And I think that's a good way to talk about something. That's always, to respect the people who are actually part of the story, right? When we're looking at a story from outside, it is, you just have to hold those truths at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Adam, is there anything else that you want to kind of leave us with today? This has been such a great conversation, and I've loved talking to you, and I just want to make sure that you have kind of the last word here. So is there anything you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting takeaways that I came away with from my time at the Prison Rodeo and speaking to both incarcerated people and attendees is that, the rodeo is really operating within larger Americana and kind of the power system that we find ourselves in. And, some of the attendees that I spoke with said they hope that just by attending the rodeo and that other attendees, that they could leave with kind of a deeper understanding of their place within their system.
Wow.
and their role in both maybe tearing it down, and also their role at sometimes in upholding it. And they raise questions about cultural ownership in this country and who gets to define what is valuable and meaningful to a society. Is it the powerful or the powerless?
Yeah, that's a kind of incredible perspective to have.
Yeah. I don't know if I agree with it, but it is a perspective that came out.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Adam. I hope we can have you back again. And this has just been so great.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. I really appreciated sharing time with you and all that y'all do.
This was American Hysteria. You can read more of Adam's work or donate to the work at Capital B by going to capitalbnews.org. You can also follow Adam on Twitter at Adam L. Mahoney. If you want to support American Hysteria, make sure we can continue making it and get ad-free episodes and bonus content. You can head to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get access to Hysteria Home Companion, the other podcast that I make with our producer Miranda, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we're covering or stories that we know that you'll love. Recently, we put up one of these episodes on our main feed called Lost Boy Larry, and that's a great example of the kind of stuff that you can get on Patreon or Apple Plus. So subscribe today. Another amazing way to help out our show is to leave us a 5-star review on the app of your choosing. You can also go to AmericanHysteria.com and leave us a message on the Urban Legends hotline about a tale you remember from growing up or one you've heard recently, and we might do an entire investigation about it. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius Smith, and I'm your host, Chelsey Weber Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great